Всем привет еще раз. Мы продолжаем. И у нас сейчас очень интересный и очень мощный спикер, вице-президент Лиги защитников животных, один из сооснователей Альянса за расправленные крылья. Аарон Росс будет выступать на тему того, как движение за социальную справедливость выигрывают в долгосрочной перспективе, выигрывают прогресс, и будет говорить о том, что ситуации, коллизии, с которыми сталкивается сейчас зоозащитное движение, они, как показывает практика, не уникальны для одного только зоозащитного движения, уже через это проходили и проходят другие освободительные движения. И на каких-то примерах вот в этой презентации мы посмотрим, как различные подходы и другие успешные движения на наглядных примерах и стратегиях, что нам делать, какую тактику нам всем выработать таким образом, чтобы, сплотившись, прийти к тому, к чему мы хотим прийти, а именно к освобождению животных, не растерять себя, ни с кем не перессориться. В общем, наслаждайтесь. Hello everyone again, and we have a very interesting, very powerful speaker right now, the Vice President of Humane League USA and co-founder of Open Wing Alliance, who is gonna make a speech about welfare versus abolition versus rights, about how social movements win progress, about the debates and some collisions inside the animal rights movement that turned out to be not to be unique for animal rights movement, and on some examples with examining the prevailing approaches and other successful social movements with some lessons and strategies. We're gonna see the whole picture of how it's going on and throughout the history, and have a more or less a picture of what we can do about it and how to cope with it. So Aaron, please.
Hey, thank you so much, Oleg. Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Very sorry I can't be with everyone in person in Georgia. I was very much looking forward to that. But man plans and COVID laughs. So hopefully next year I'll be able to see you all. But nonetheless, I'm very glad that I still get to discuss this topic with you. I hope you find it helpful, and I will go ahead and get started.
Звук, Олег, звук.
A very short topic. Thank you, Timofey. A very short thing to say. Sorry, Aaron. Sure. If any of you wants to ask Aaron the questions, and you are not on Zoom for some reason, you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your comments there, and we will forward these comments, questions to Aaron, so he'll be able to answer you. Please don't hesitate to ask. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Sorry.
Cool. All right, so this is the cosmic calendar. It's a method to visualize the timeline of the universe. It compresses the universe's 13.8 billion year history into a single calendar year. The concept was popularized by Carl Sagan in his book, The Dragons of Eden, and also on his television series, The Cosmos. Actually, I have, that's who is right behind me, is Carl Sagan. And up on the far left of this calendar, you can see on January 1st, on the very first second, we have the Big Bang, the creation of the universe. 13.8 billion years later is our present time, which is midnight on December 31st. And on this scale, the Milky Way galaxy formed around May 15th. The solar system, including the Earth and the sun, formed around September 2nd. Dinosaurs appeared around December 25th and went extinct around December 30th. On the last day, in that last minute, in the last 30 seconds, humans began domesticating plants and animals. They started settling and starting agricultural societies and developed permanent cities. Now, everything in our recorded history, every person we've ever heard of, Jesus, the Buddha, Muhammad, all the emperors of dynastic China, all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, all the Greek and Roman philosophers, and every event in the history books all happened in that little black dot in the last 10 seconds of the last minute of December 31st. And it was all for humans, right? Well, that's what we thought for most of our history, and that's what many people still think today, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But one thing is for sure, and that is humans have a very bad sense of time, especially when it comes to anything longer than a human lifespan, and certainly when it comes to deep time. It took us thousands of years to discover the fact of evolution, the extremely gradual but undeniably strong force of change which led to our existence. And the fact is, we really have trouble understanding anything on any large scale. And this is true for the suffering of animals as well. We all happen to be born during a time to witness the rise of factory farming, in which our societies breed, confine, abuse, and kill trillions of sentient animals each year. That's trillions. Trillions are killed every single year. I could say it over and over and over again, but it is impossible to really understand how huge that number really is. To give you some idea, if you spent $1 million every single day since the day Jesus was born, you would not have spent even close to $1 trillion by now. And we slaughter that many in less than a year. And these numbers are increasing, very sadly. And when you look at these numbers, it can be pretty discouraging, especially for all of us who dedicate our short and precious time to ending this horrible abuse. And I know how hopeless it can feel. But when I start to feel this certain way, I have to stop and remind myself that the fact is, just like cosmic and biological evolution, social evolution is an extremely gradual process, and it happens on timescales that are hard for us to perceive with good understanding, and it is not always linear. So what I'd like to do today is ask you to zoom out with me and take a look at the calendars of other social movements that have successfully caused extraordinary change, even when they were up against all odds. And we want to look at their strategy and their milestones and what they achieved along the way over their long histories. And then we're going to consider where we are in our history for the struggle for animal rights. So I'm going to go through 3 examples that I'd like to take a look at today. And the first is the child labor movement in the US. For most of the history in the United States, children had absolutely no rights. They were largely viewed as property and were literally owned by their parents, who exerted absolute power and control and authority over them. Now, society's view of children started to shift during the Age of Enlightenment. The first acts of children's rights activism were actually sanctuaries for abused and neglected and abandoned children. Here's a picture of the very first child sanctuary. Now, the use of child labor increased during the Industrial Revolution and became the focus of the children's rights movement. So the movement for children's rights largely focused on welfare reforms at the time. In the 1800s, the United Kingdom passed a series of labor laws which concentrated on limiting and regulating the number of hours worked for children in factories and improved their working conditions. But these laws were effectively unenforced for many years until an Enforcement Act was passed in 1833. Now, similar laws spread over into the United States in 1836, with Massachusetts becoming the first US state to adopt children's welfare laws. These laws stated that if you were going to put your child into forced hard labor camps, they at least have to go to school for 3 months out of the year. And then for the next 90 years, there were a number of small welfare measures passed, and the public support for children's rights started to grow during this time. And also during this time, we saw the number of organizations advocating for children's welfare grow as well. In fact, it exploded. I mean, we had just an enormous number of children's rights organizations popping up during this time. And then in 1924, Congress attempted to pass a constitutional amendment that would authorize a national child labor law. However, this law was blocked by opposition within Congress. So think about that. Public officials in the government were openly debating and opposing giving children basic protection and defended the practice of forcing young children into 16-hour days of hard labor in coal mines and cotton fields and in factories. And this was less than 100 years ago that the government was openly opposing basic rights for children. And then about 20 years later, in 1938, we saw the beginning of a 50-year landslide of children's rights laws. There's finally a breakthrough. And the Fair Labor Standards Act were passed, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, and many other very strong children's rights laws were passed and ratified. And then finally, in 1989, the United Nations codified a range of children's rights issues into international law. And then 189 countries around the world eventually adopted those policies. All right, the second example I'd like to take a look at is the struggle for women's rights. In 1777, just 1 year after the United States was founded, women started to lose their right to vote. By 1807, within 30 years, all states had banned women from voting. Now, in the 1700s, limited voting rights were granted to some women in a few countries and in one US state. But by the 1800s, almost all of these were reversed. Now, in 1938, Kentucky passed the first statewide women's suffrage law, allowing certain women to have limited voting power. And then in 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The women's suffrage was proposed and agreed upon as the main campaign focus of the movement. And then in 1869, the territory of Wyoming was the first to grant unrestricted rights to vote to women. And then in 1875, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution does not grant women the right to vote. So just think about that for a second. Imagine how women and the women's rights movement must have felt at this time. They were fighting for decades and just to get a very basic right to vote. And with a single stroke of a pen, all of that work, all of that progress is erased. And the government at the highest level effectively denies women any basic rights at all. And then after that, there is a deafening silence in terms of progress, lasting for decades. But then in 1875, oops, sorry about that. But then things continued to get even worse after this, after 1875. Many years later, in 1913, Alice Paul organized a women's suffrage procession, which is basically a giant parade, a giant march through Washington, D.C. It was the largest women's rights march in history. The parade was attacked by a mob and hundreds of women were injured, but no one was arrested. None of the attackers were arrested. And then in 1918, about 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would prohibit the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote, to citizens of the United States on the basis of their sex was rejected in the United States Senate. So again, we're just seeing just decades of huge losses for the women's rights movement. But despite these major losses, women did not stop fighting. When things got worse for the movement, they didn't just give up, they worked even harder. And then finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution is passed and ratified, stating that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any Senate on the account of sex. And in 1984, Mississippi becomes finally the last state in the Union to ratify the 19th Amendment. And today, the fight for women's equality continues. But I mean, look at this timeline. This was a 207-year struggle full of campaigning, hostility, major victories, major losses along the way, major setbacks, all for a right as basic as having a say in public policy in their own society. And finally, I'd like to look at the example of the gay rights movement. Now, for most of our history, in the US anyway, the gay community was highly persecuted, and the penalty for being gay, just for even existing as a gay person, was anywhere between a monetary fine, imprisonment, castration, or even death. And because of this, as early as the turn of the 20th century, several gay rights groups were formed and were very active, but they had to work in hiding in order to avoid being arrested or being killed by the government. And unfortunately, very little is known about those first groups. But what we do have records on is during the first half of the 20th century, being gay was considered an official mental disorder. And at best, gays were seen as deviants in society. So the focus of the movement at the time was to assimilate gays into mainstream culture. And they did this through television and radio. So basically, they were having gay characters in television and radio. And the goal was to normalize being gay or normalize gay and provide some level of acceptance in society. But unfortunately, there was widespread harassment and persecution of the gay community at the time, and that continued. And in the 1960s, police would raid gay clubs and just go in and beat people up and arrest them. And in 1969, the police picked the wrong bar to do this in, and they went to a gay bar in New York called the Stonewall Inn. And the people in the Stonewall Inn during the raid said, "Fuck this, we're fighting back." And they started a 3-day riot against the police. Now, the Stonewall riots was just a absolutely pivotal moment in history. It completely transformed the gay rights movement from just a small number of activists to a very large, widespread mainstream movement across the nation. It was a huge moment in history. And then within a few years, just like we saw with the child labor movement and the women's rights movement, there was this period where there was an explosion of gay rights organizations that just started and popped up all across the United States and the world after this. And the gay rights movement spread to countries around the world and heavily influenced many of the modern gay rights organizations that we see today, such as the Gay Liberation Front, Human Rights Campaign, and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Now, in the late 70s, many cities had anti-discrimination laws. And these protected gay people from being denied housing and education and healthcare, those basic rights. And in 1977, local governments were trying to reverse these laws. And Harvey Milk, who was the first openly gay elected official in the history of California, stopped the reversal effort in his district. This was a huge victory for the gay rights movement. I mean, absolutely monumental. They stopped this huge effort to reverse the gay rights laws. But after that, there was a huge backlash all over the country. And a wave of laws to reverse gay rights ordinances were introduced in 82 cities and 9 at the state level. Sadly, 62 of them passed, reversing most gay rights laws in the country. And then things got even worse for the movement. About 25 years ago, in 1996, the United States Congress enacted the Defense of Marriage Act, which essentially banned gay marriage federally. The federal government refused to recognize gay marriage. I mean, this was in the 90s. This was like, this is like when Nirvana was popular. This happened. It was absolutely crazy. And during this time, hate crimes against homosexuals started to increase. However, also during this time, the revival of the decriminalization of homosexuality gained momentum over the course of several decades. And in 2003, same-sex acts were no longer illegal across the United States. So they were not guaranteed any rights, but this basically made it legal to exist if you're gay. I mean, talk about basic welfare. That you don't get any more basic welfare than just having the right to exist. And then in 2009, the federal government expanded the hate crime prevention laws, helping to provide extra legal protection to gay people if they are victims of violent crimes. And in 2011, gay men and women are allowed to be in the military, finally, openly. And so they can openly serve in the military as gay. This was the reversal of the don't ask, don't tell policy. And finally, in 2015, the United States ruled that the right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples, a ruling that President Obama called a victory for America. I mean, so look at this history. It is crazy going from the 1920s, where being gay was considered a mental disorder, to present time, where the White House of the United States is lit up in a gay flag. I mean, that is enormous progress. Okay, so what do all these movements have in common? Well, these movements started out as highly marginalized. I mean, these movements were trying to reverse sometimes prejudice that was deeply ingrained in our culture, sometimes for millennia. And the cause is extremely unpopular. So they get a lot of resistance from society. They also have very long histories, spanning hundreds of years, sometimes many hundreds of years. And the progress is often not linear. Sometimes it's actually going in reverse. And we saw in every single movement, there were periods where things got worse for the movement for decades before things got better. And then the movement's goals were always to achieve total liberation. But the public-facing campaigns were typically incremental welfare reforms that the public could at least support. So now I want to take a look at the animal rights movement and its history and think about where we are in our history. And I think we can see, and I think you will see, similar patterns in the animal rights movement that we've seen in other successful social movements. Now, the idea for animal rights is nothing new. Greek philosopher Pythagoras was the first that we know of in a line of several Greek and Roman philosophers to teach that animals should not be tortured or mistreated. And they also advocated not eating them. They were the first vegetarians that we know of in history. And in the US, we didn't see any major action for animals until 1866, when the first animal protection organization in the US was founded, which was the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, otherwise known as ASPCA. But the modern animal rights movement is marked largely by the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation in 1975. I have a very funny story about an experience I had with Peter Singer. The first time I saw him speak was at the United States Animal Rights Conference in 2001. And while he was speaking about animal rights and the ethics of animals and eating animals, a spider lowered itself from the ceiling and landed on his forehead, which he reflexively swatted and killed with his hand. And keep in mind, this was in front of like hundreds of radical animal rights activists. So then he was forced to share his thoughts on the rights of arthropods on the spot. But anyway, yeah, 1975, the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation really marked the beginning of the modern animal rights movement. And then 1 year after this, in 1976, the militant underground animal rights group, Animal Liberation Front, or ALF, is founded in Britain and quickly spreads to the United States. Around this time, Henry Spira, who's possibly the most influential animal activist to ever live, founded the Animal Rights International Organization. And in 1976, he led the first ever campaigns that succeeded in getting institutions to stop animal experiments. He later went on to successfully campaign against McDonald's to end face branding of cattle, and got some of the largest cosmetic companies in the world to end animal testing. And then in the 1980s, we saw the forming of the early animal rights groups, such as PETA and Farm Animal Rights Movement and Farm Sanctuary. And then in the 90s, the open rescue movement, which is basically when groups go into like a factory farm with no mask on, and they take animals, they liberate them, and they film it, and then they release that to the public. This movement started in the 90s and started in Australia, and then it spread over into the US in 2001. Now, these are photos of the first major open rescue and expose of a battery cage farm in the United States. This was the beginning of decades of long campaigning to expose factory farming through investigations. Now, in the early 2000s, we saw the founding of animal rights groups, which focused on farmed animal rights. So, for most of our history, in terms of animal rights, we had most groups were advocating for wild animals or cats and dogs. But in the early 2000s, we saw a whole bunch of groups that were founded that had the focus of helping farmed animals. And soon after this, all the major organizations started focusing on abolishing the worst practices in factory farming, such as intensive confinement and forcing animals to live in tiny cages. And in the mid-2000s, 6 states passed restrictions and bans on the use of cages. And between 2014 and 2017, just 3 short years, the corporate cage-free campaign had massive success, getting virtually the entire food industry in North America to start eliminating battery cages from their supply chains. This was just such a huge breakthrough and in incremental reforms, and was the first time we saw a major turning point in the movement for animals. In fact, over 380 of North America's largest food companies are phasing out the use of cages now. But this was also important because this was the first time the animal rights movement just completely beat an entire industry. This is what the head of the US egg industry had to say about the cage-free campaign at the height of it. He said, "The Humane League have been harassing and bombarding every retailer, every food manufacturer, every food company there is with a very aggressive cage-free campaign. They're the ones that have been driving this. There is no question about it. Chaos, market disruption, and just a complete lack of control. And this campaign also opened opportunities for other issues, such as significant welfare reforms for broiler chickens, which we are now campaigning for in the United States. We are also now starting to see very strong legislative bans on cages and crates for farmed animals, and not just bans on using them, but we're now seeing bans on selling products that come from caged animals. That's how strong this legislation is. Also, we're starting to see a massive shift in how society views captive animals and keeping animals in captivity. After massive outcry from the public, SeaWorld, which kept orcas basically as slaves for entertainment, announced finally that they were going to end their killer whale show after one of their key whales died. And then more recently, Ringling Brothers and Barnum & Bailey, America's most notorious animal circus, which has been around since 1871, shut down. They just completely shut down after decades of being protested, and they cited society's growing concern for animals as the reason that they were closing their doors. We're also starting to see cities ban fur. I mean, this is Los Angeles, the largest city in the United States, recently announced that they are banning the sale of fur. And then we're seeing tech companies out of Silicon Valley making alternatives to animal products, and major corporations, the same ones that went cage-free with their eggs at first, are now starting to replace them with vegan alternatives. And even meat companies, including the biggest meat company in the United States, is starting to invest in vegan products and starting their own line of vegan meats. This is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. And now we're starting to see headlines like this. The public is starting to finally accept vegan food into the mainstream. Even shitty fast food restaurants like Burger King are starting to carry these vegan meats, and KFC tested vegan chicken in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia, and sold out in under 5 hours. And they are now expanding this to stores across the nation. This is just a huge shift in our culture and society's view about animals and just about vegan eating in general. And we basically arrived at this point because we first took small, pragmatic steps and never stopped taking them. This is Martin Bollock's theory of change. And basically, it's just a theory of gradual progress. If we make some small progress and we keep making it, eventually we can achieve very big progress. And if you look at this graph, we are now somewhere in the middle to late middle part, the stages of this graph. So we are slowly pulling society along to a world where animals have rights. And again, we are getting there because we were taking one small step at a time. So there is a day out there in the future where there will not be any more factory farming, and there will not be any more exploitation of animals. It could be 50 years from now. It could be 100 years from now. It could be 10,000 years from now. But how soon that day comes is up to us and how we decide to advocate. And to quote my friend Carl Sagan, what happens in the first second of the next cosmic year depends on what we do here and now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I will have a look on Facebook if we have questions there. If not, I guess we ask you. No, not yet. I wanted to ask one thing. Norm Phelps, in his book Changing the Game, also writes about these processes. He says that these are kind of waves, no? That we are now on this, on the very down of this way of the liberal let's say, liberal crisis. That's why these pragmatic small steps are more effective than something really radical. But he's referring to the fact that as long as these are the waves, there will be like sooner or later time for the more aggressive steps, as it was like in 70s for the Animal Liberation Front times and so on. What do you think, like where is this wave, how is this wave moving now, and like how soon there will be time for more radical stuff? I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So in the 70s and 80s, it was very difficult to get society to take the rights of animals seriously, and it was hard to even get attention for this. So for any animal issues at all. So what groups had to do back then, like PETA, for instance, they had to do very radical public stunts just in order to get the media to pay attention, to even get animals mentioned in the media. They had to do things like that. However, that is not the case any longer. Probably in the last like 20 years, maybe 15 years, the media is starting to take these issues very seriously. And we're also starting to see the public start to side with these issues. So the public is starting to support protection for animals. Now, the public is still very critical of like veganism and complete liberation for animals. They're not there yet, but I think we've seen a huge shift in society's support for the protection of animals. So I think we're now at a point where we should take advantage of that support. We should use that support wherever we can. So we should be trying to create animal protection laws and regulations and policies from companies and governments, and trying to expose the public to more and more vegan food and just make it normal, and really just use that support that we have right now and just continue to grow it. And I think right now, I think if we, in the US anyway, we shifted away from the radical side of the movement. So, 15 years ago, we were very radical. We were doing very radical things. We've moved away from that now. We're focusing more on growing the popularity and support of animal protection and basic things like normalizing vegan food. And I think if we were to do something more radical right now, that could harm that growing public support. So I don't think we're there yet to start being radical again, but I'm sure there will come a day though. Once the public support has grown large enough, I think then we might be in the space to do that again.
As one of my ex-colleagues said, citing another animal rights activist, professional is a new radical. Yeah, something like this. Also, there is this concept saying that the radical actions, like terrorism or something, is the tactics of the weak, and this really inspires that as long as the power, I mean the media power, even the governmental power of animal rights is growing. It doesn't look like it's really needed, because it became much easier to put the agenda through the media and so on. But how is it going in the United States now? I mean, because here in let's say Eurasia, in Europe, we have these contradictions between let's say people who are not ready to accept this pragmatism, welfareist things, and even though that the practice shows that it's working. How is it in United States? Do people admit that these steps work? Is there any consensus, I mean, around in animal rights movement?
Yeah, I'd say in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, over the last 10 years, there was huge debate. Probably for most of this, in the 2000s, there's probably, there's a very big debate about welfare versus abolition and which direction the movement should go in. But in the last like 5 years, we've really seen that fizzle out. We don't really hear that debate anymore. And the consensus in the US movement has been, right now is a time where we see an opportunity. We can make a lot of progress through welfare reforms, while doing other things like promoting veganism and getting vegan food into major companies. But we just see a huge opportunity for welfare reform. And that's just basically been, that's been the consensus. And the debate is basically over. And I think I've always hated that debate anyway. I think it's almost a stupid, it's just asking the wrong question. It's not should we do welfare or abolition. It's, the question should be, what is most effective for animals right now? And we should be willing to do whatever that is, whether that feels, maybe it feels uncomfortable for us. Maybe people feel like they're selling out, or that, that it's not, they're not being radical enough, or they're not being martyrs for the movement. But this is not, the movement is not about us, it's about animals. And we should be thinking, what is most effective to do for animals right now? And sometimes that is being very radical. And sometimes that is, damaging property and breaking in to farms, which I've done all that stuff myself. I have a very long history of that. But right now, I don't think that is the most effective thing to be doing. At one point, that was very effective, and we used those tactics well, and we learned a lot from them. But right now, we don't see that as effective. And many of the founders of the Humane League, including myself, we come from like a punk rock background, very, very radical. But sometimes, kind of as you hinted at earlier, sometimes the most punk rock thing you can do is put on a suit and go, and be a little professional, and go and meet with, the government or giant corporations. Sometimes that's the most punk rock thing to do. But again, you just have to think about the context of the environment that you're working in and what is going on. And again, the question should never be, what ideology should we use? What, welfare versus abolition? No, the question should be, what is most effective for animals right now?
And in your opinion, what is the most effective? For example, there are debates now, like how effective the investigations are, because some people say, if you put it in the media in the proper way, it will be a breakthrough. Some people say better to focus on this corporate stuff, negotiating with the companies. What do you think, like the most pragmatic things to focus on for the activists if they want to reach the most productive results for the animals right now? I mean, like these years.
Yeah, I don't think there is one answer to that that would fit every single country, because I think the situation is very different in different countries. In the US right now, for instance, investigations have not been the most effective because the media just stopped caring about them. For the last like 50 years or something, the media was publishing investigations in the US. And in the last in the last 20 years, they were publishing them a lot. And it was very, very popular and very effective in the media. However, in the last 5 years or so, the media really just stopped caring about investigations in the US, and investigations have not become very effective anymore in the US. So we just have to use different tactics now. But however, in some countries, investigations are that's what they should be doing right now. They should be doing a lot of them, because in some countries, just because of the context they're working in, that could be groundbreaking. Like for instance, in Poland, they did an investigation, a massive investigation of fur farms. And this led to legislation being introduced to ban fur in Poland. And Poland's one of the biggest fur producing countries in the world. And they actually they've already voted on this, at least in the first level of the government, and it passed. And that was because this investigation came out. So I think it really depends on what's going on in your country and kind of the atmosphere. But yeah, I think you should always just take that into context, and it's never just like, there's never just one way forward. It's really like what is going to work right now. I think that's the question.
And how much of in this process do you think different kind of political and social processes are involved? I mean, for example, Asia, such countries as India and China. On the one hand, what we can see is the growth of the middle class, which turns out to be more concerned about animals and animal rights on the one hand. On the other hand, as one of my friends in States once said, we are exporting states. We export from the United States, we are exporting SAD, meaning standard American diet. So every time somewhere in Asia, the middle class is growing, people get more and more convinced that, now we can afford it, now we should eat meat. So this is how the growth of animal products consumption can be seen. What parts of these processes, especially in Asia or in Brazil, for example, is how much is it involved, and what can we do about it if we can?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I don't have a good answer to that. I do see that there is, like you mentioned, there's a paradox there where, as like the middle class grows in societies, we always see, we do see an increase of the consumption of animals and consumerism in general, and that's bad, obviously. But we also then start to see society really begin to start changing their view of animals eventually. That seems to be pretty common. So I don't know, it seems like, one of those situations where you take some steps forward and some steps back. But like I said, I think progress is not always linear. It's not always just like a logical, straightforward path. But I don't know. I think that question is still still yet to be answered. So, but I think, considering we don't have much control over the growth of middle class economies or anything, I would say that considering that's happening, we should do what we can to take advantage of that and use whatever opportunities we have. And in those countries where middle class is growing, I think we should try to optimize society's concern for animals and get them to just support animal protection laws and introduce, vegan eating and normalize vegan in those societies. I think that's the best thing we can do.
And promote the alternatives also, no, I guess, for sure.
Exactly.
I know that it might sound stupid, but people love predictions, people love forecasts. And you, as a person who studied a lot about other social movements of that kind, according to how we see, of course, this process is not linear, as you said many times, but if we look at the calendar the way it's developing now, what would be your personal forecast? Like, will we witness the days, at least in one country, when it will be more or less some basic rights of animals passed, or something like, or like how do you see our point on this scale? Because Norm Phelps, coming back to Norm Phelps, he says we are not even the one before the last generation, where like maybe the first or the second generation, and we just need to put these bricks of the basement, no? But what is your opinion about that? How far are we from the final points, let's say?
Yeah,
according to how it's going now, I mean, of course, it can be.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll premise this by saying, I think, if anyone claims to know like what's going to happen even in the next like 10 years, I don't trust them. I don't believe them. Sure. I think things are so unpredictable. But if I had to take a guess, based off of how the movement has been progressing, I think we are still at the very early stages. I am with Norm Phelps on this one, where I think we are still just laying the bricks of the basement. But that said, I think we are also moving at lightning speed. If you look at like again, like in the US, where like in the last 100 years, it was, it was legal to beat your children and women had no rights to vote. People are still alive from that time, like, so I think considering we're just starting to gain basic rights for people, I think we're making lightning speed progress for animals. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I think we're seeing these revolutions happen over time. Like we're seeing the plant-based revolution is happening now. Like now it's just becoming normal to eat vegan meat. That is very new. I mean, this is like in the last couple of years, this has happened. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I see very tangible changes too. Like when I go to the supermarket, I remember when I first went vegan, it was about 20 years ago. I remember you used to go into the supermarket and you would be lucky if you found soy milk in the supermarket. And you'd be very lucky if you found some like horrible cardboard tasting veggie burger, So, but now you go into the grocery store and there's like an entire aisle dedicated to like vegan and vegetarian and natural foods. So I think we're moving at a very fast pace. I still think we're in early stages, and I think it would be possible, like by the end of this century, to really like end factory farming. I do think something like that is a possibility if we just keep fighting.
Mm-hmm. I'm used to have a common phrase already each time I hear from people that, oh, come on, Oleg, yeah, it's nice you're fighting for animals, but you realize that people always oppressed animals. Nothing is going to change. I say, do you know where and when the slavery ended on this planet last time? They say, no. I said, I was 2 years old. I was already alive. It was 1984 when the last country on this planet finally banned this human slavery. And like even imagining that it can be a reverse now, I guess it's completely crazy, but it was completely okay. I was already alive and it could happen. So yeah, this is referring to your thesis about the lightning speed. It's really going on, and we just don't know exactly what direction we are flying, I guess. Does anyone have any more questions to Aaron?
Yeah, can I?
Sure.
I'm thinking about burnouting, because these goals and this process is really long, and it's hard to to get the right the supportive feedback from the reality on a daily basis. So maybe can you give an advice to animal activists how to find the balance between activism with long-term perspective and daily self-care?
Yeah, a very good question. Because I think there is nothing more valuable in the movement than a long-term activist, like a lifelong activist. So I think if what you're saying, if activists burn out, I think that we just lose so much from that, considering how small the animal rights movement really is. I mean, it's not that many people, So yeah, I think it's something we should take very seriously, what you're asking. And I think this is one of the benefits of doing incremental reform, is that you get to see very tangible change step by step. So for instance, I was hiking a mountain one time in South Africa, Table Mountain, this huge mountain. And it was basically going like straight up. And it was very, very exhausting. And so one thing that I did with my friends who were also hiking it with me, we would just make little short-term goals. We would just say, hey, let's just make it to that tree up there, and then we'll take a break. And then once we got to that tree, we're like, all right, now we're going to that tree, and so on. And it just made it so much more rewarding and possible, where if we were just, when we were at the bottom of the mountain, just looking up, it just looked impossible. But step by step, we're out there. I know that sounds corny, but I do think that there's truth there. So I think having like those achievable victories along the way is extremely good for morale. Like, I think if you are just constantly doing something that has no visible impact, if that's all you do and the impact is very abstract, I think you're at much higher risk of burning out than if you, I think it's good to do those things that aren't very measurable, you know, like education and distributing literature and information. It's hard to measure the impact of those or see the immediate effects, but I think you should still do them. But I think in combination with doing other things that have very tangible victories and short-term goals where you can see results and have things to celebrate along the way.
We have a question on Facebook from Masha Pronchenko.
Yeah.
She asks Aaron to give any statistics about the cage-free campaigning. Like, can you summarize, like, throughout this year, how many companies, how many like saved and so on?
Yeah, so the cage-free campaign, I'd say really started, like the worldwide one, started about in 2016. So it's very recent, very recent. But since then, over 1,800 companies around the world are phasing out cages. Some of them are, and this includes like some of the largest food companies on planet Earth, and including the largest food company on planet Earth, which is Nestle. And yeah, so that's all happened within like just a few years. And then we have more specific statistics in each country. So for instance, in the US, for most of our history, the cage-free basically was non-existent. It was almost like 100% of eggs came from hens that were kept in battery cages. However, in the last like just 3 years, we've seen cage-free production. The percentage of cage-free is now at 26%. So within just a few years, we've seen like unprecedented growth in terms of that percentage. So farmers are literally ripping out cages, bulldozing cage farms. So that has been in an extremely short amount of time that has happened. And then, yeah, and then more recently, in terms of statistics, we've seen a lot of states in the US start to ban the use of cages. And more recently, since 2016, we started to see states start to ban the sale of any products coming from any animals that are kept in cages. So Massachusetts was the first in 2016. And since then, we've seen several other states make those laws, including California, which is you know, the US's most populous state. California has the population the size of Canada, of like an entire country. And they banned the sale of any products coming from cages. So even if a company is making, you know, eggs or whatever from another state, they cannot sell them in California. And then we've seen Washington and Oregon make those as well. And now in European Union, there is the Citizens Initiative that has been introduced, and they got over the 1 million signatures to get the European Union to start discussing a ban on cages across the European Union. And there are several countries that have already banned cages, such as like Switzerland and Germany. More recently, the Czech Republic voted in favor of this. So yeah, so a lot going on in a very short amount of time.
Does anyone have more questions, maybe? Yura? Have a question? But you don't have sound. Ah, yeah, now you have sound.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Hi all.
Hello.
I have one question for Aaron. What's the next step for chickens after cage-free campaign wins? What's the next step for animal liberation movement? Maybe free range, or maybe just ban of this industry?
Yeah, so we've already moved on from cage free, and now we're focusing on like broiler chickens, and basically for broiler chickens we are doing a whole host of reform changes for them. So this includes making sure that they're not grown so fast, like because right now they've been genetically selected to grow extremely fast in extremely short amount of time. And that's probably the number one cause of their suffering. It probably causes more suffering than anything else. They also have, like, they just live in completely barren environments. So they have, you know, chickens are basically jungle animals. So in the jungle, they have all this stuff to interact with, but in these sheds, they have absolutely nothing to interact with. And then we're also asking for them to reduce the number of chickens per shed, and also get rid of the live shackling and electric stunning of slaughter. So it's like all these different points. It's a pretty complicated ask, and it's also very expensive for the chicken industry. So that's what we're fighting for right now in the US and in parts of Europe where the cage-free campaign has succeeded. So that's kind of the next step. And then in some parts of Europe where they can do it, they are asking for free range as well. So it is starting to kind of basically reverse this trend over the last 60 years that has been confining animals in smaller and smaller and smaller spaces, basically starting to try to reverse that process. So that's kind of what we're seeing. And then in countries where they're making progress on both the cage-free and the broiler policies, some groups are starting to work on welfare policies for fish as well.
Yeah, and can you say about chickens for the eggs? How do you see step-by-step liberation of these birds from cage-free to total liberation?
Yeah, so we see a lot of benefits from things like welfare reforms. So we see them as, one, we think they are good in themselves. They are just good alone, even if they didn't do anything else other than just actually reform the conditions and reduce suffering. So we see a lot of reduction in suffering from them for that. But we also see another benefit is that they are expensive and they cost the animal agriculture industry a lot of money. It's extremely inconvenient. The egg industry in the United States said that they expect about 1/3 of all egg producers to go out of business due to the cage-free switch, because they just won't be able to afford that. Because it's going to cost the egg industry about $10 billion or so, maybe more. There's some estimates out there from universities. It's going to cost the egg industry over $10 billion. So I think that is a very good step towards animal liberation. Is basically costing the animal abusing industries lots of money. And then also I think it just raises the debate in society about how animals should be treated. So every time we get a cage-free victory and that gets in the media, that gets people to start talking and debating about how animals should be treated in the first place. And the more that happens, then the more companies and the more companies go cage-free, and the more the public supports it. And then it creates like a positive feedback cycle. And then that leads to companies associating themselves with concern for animals. And that also leads to the public associating themselves with concern for animals. So we see many kind of peripheral benefits to the welfare campaign other than just the welfare itself.
Yeah, can I ask one more question? I have a question about volunteers or paid staff. A couple of hours ago, we discussed about this with Julia from Voices for Animals. And like, how do you think, like, what the better, I mean, maybe it's not connected with topic, but maybe you have your inner feeling or experience about this. How do you think what's the most efficient way to create the new world, like by paid members, paid staff, or by volunteers, or maybe some percentage between them? Because we have, like, in my organization, we have a discussion: should we like have a person who will take care about volunteers and have a like a headache about this, or should we just hire a couple of persons who will do a lot of work, maybe more than all volunteers will? Yeah, sorry for messed English. Yeah.
No, very good. Yeah, I think this relates back to your question earlier about burnout. I think we are very limited as just strictly volunteers. I think volunteers can do a lot, and they are absolutely essential to the success of the movement. But I think probably the best thing that we can do is work to grow the professional movement. So get as many people doing this work full-time, where they don't have any job they have to worry about. All they're doing is activism. All they think about all day, every day is just doing activism. So I think that is the best possible scenario. The challenge there is actually finding that money to actually hire people, which I know you speak about fundraising. And one good thing though that we've seen in recent years in the animal rights movement is just a huge injection of funding. I mean, it wasn't long ago where the animal rights movement worldwide basically had no money, like at all. And it was mostly volunteer run, but that has changed in the last, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, especially in recent years. We're starting to see a lot of money come into the movement. A lot of like effective altruists are now starting to donate to animal causes. So that, I think, is going to be just an absolute game changer. I think that was critical in the cage-free movement. It just gave us such a huge boost. And I think the best case scenario is for organizations all around the world to just at least get some hired staff full-time. And then that can also help manage volunteers and increase and kind of optimize their impact. So I think it just has benefits all around. And I remember a time where it was frowned upon, or it was looked down on if you did activism and got paid for it. Like people would call you a sellout and everything. But again, I think we need to move away from that, and we need to get, what we need is people working on this full time, as many people as we can working on this full time.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions, anyone? Okay, then. Aaron, thank you so much. It was not only interesting and informative, it was super inspiring and empowering. I don't know, at least for myself. And yeah, thanks a lot for doing that for us. And yeah, have a good day once again. Sorry for waking you up so early.
No problem. It was my pleasure. It was very nice seeing you all, and I hope.
Thank you. Thank you so
this
much.
was helpful. And Yura, good luck with your presentation next. See you later.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao. Bye bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.